Imagine a farmer it's 1945, and he's digging for fertilizer in this really soft, sun-baked dirt in the Egyptian desert. And suddenly, his shovel hits something hard.
Right. He hits this massive, sealed, red earthenware jar.
Yeah, and he cracks it open, probably expecting, I don't know, gold or ancient coins or something valuable. But instead, what spills out is this stack of banned, leather-bound books. And these books claim that the creator of our physical universe isn't some loving God, but actually an arrogant, blind mistake.
Which is just a wild thing to pull out of the dirt.
Totally. And today, 80 years after that farmer cracked that jar open, we are using cutting-edge artificial intelligence to decode the terrifying, beautiful, and just deeply controversial secrets that were hidden inside those brittle pages.
It really is this profound collision of worlds. You have the ancient sands of Nag Hammadi on one side, and then, these climate-controlled server farms training neural networks on the other.
It's crazy. So welcome to this deep dive. I'm so glad you could join us today. Our mission for this deep dive is to unpack this extraordinary stack of historical research, archaeological reports, and digital philology that all surrounds one single, explosive, ancient text.
The Gospel of Mary Magdalene.
Yes, exactly. We are going to explore the mind-bending cosmology of early Christian mystics, examine what their alternative theology actually means for the structure of modern religion, and reveal how AI is currently reconstructing these fragmented codes.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because for nearly 2,000 years, Western culture has operated on a very specific, carefully managed narrative about how its dominant religion began.
Right. And what's fascinating here is the sheer mechanics of that narrative management. The Orthodox master story that we all grew up with is incredibly linear. It posits that a single unified doctrine was handed down perfectly from a teacher to 12 men.
Just 12 guys getting the exact download. Exactly. And then they distributed it perfectly to the next generation of men, and so on. And the idea was that any deviation from that doctrine was framed as a later malicious corruption, like a heresy injected into a pristine system. But when you actually read the primary sources we pulled from these Egyptian sands, that linear timeline just disintegrates entirely.
It just falls apart. And to really understand how that timeline falls apart, we need to look at the actual physical objects that broke it. We mentioned the 1945 Nag Hammadi discovery with that farmer, Muhammad Ali al-Saman.
Yeah, which was huge.
Huge. That gave us the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip. But there was actually an earlier earthquake that hit the academic world long before anyone was digging for fertilizer.
We need to go back to 1896 for that one. Cairo, Egypt. A German scholar named Dr. Carl Schmidt is navigating the bustling antiquities market there.
Yeah.
And he comes across a papyrus book, a codex, that we now call the Berlin Codex. Or, if you want the formal name, Papyrus Berlinensis 8502.
Which is a mouthful. But I can just picture this guy in a dusty Cairo shop peering through a magnifying glass at something that literally hasn't seen the light of day in 15 centuries.
And the physical object itself is remarkable. It's a 5th century Coptic manuscript originating from Akhmim, which is a city in central Egypt. And it was bound in a leather cover, but lined with actual scrap papyrus.
Wow, so just recycled garbage from the ancient world holding it together?
Basically, yeah. And for context, Coptic is the final evolutionary stage of the ancient Egyptian language, but it uses the Greek alphabet. Plus, a few demotic signs thrown in. It was essentially the lingua franca of early Egyptian Christians.
Okay, so Schmidt opens this leather-bound book, translates the Coptic, and realizes he is holding the banned book section of early Christianity.
Exactly. He finds texts that Orthodox historians assumed had been successfully eradicated. The Codex contained the Apocryphon of John, the Sophia of Jesus Christ, an epitome of the Act of Peter, and most critically for our discussion today, the Gospel of Mary.
Which is wild, because before 1896, the only way we knew these specific groups even existed was through the writings of the people who hated them.
Pharisee hunters.
Exactly, the guys trying to shut them down. I keep thinking about this in terms of, software development. If early Christianity was a decentralized open source project, you've got different communities in Rome, Alexandria, or Akhmim taking the base code of Jesus' teachings and building their own wildly different applications.
That's a great way to look at it.
Right. But eventually you get figures like the 2nd century Bishop Irenaeus of Lyon. Irenaeus is essentially the aggressive system admin who decides the open source era is over. He wants a single proprietary operating system.
And to enforce that proprietary system, Irenaeus had to label every other branch of the code as malicious software. He wrote these massive multi-volume polemics against these alternative communities.
Like incredibly detailed takedowns.
Oh, absolutely exhaustive. He claimed they worshipped a false god, that they destroyed the concept of salvation, and this is a point that will become central to our discussion again. He was furious that they allowed women to teach, prophesy, and lead.
But the victors write the history books, so for nearly 2 millennia, the only surviving records of these alternative communities were Irenaeus's furious blog posts tearing them down. We didn't have the original code to see if his critiques were even accurate.
Until Schmidt in Cairo and Al-Saman and Nag Hammadi. Suddenly, we had the source documents, unmediated by their enemies. And the theology they revealed was staggeringly complex.
Yeah.
I mean, it drew heavily on Greek Platonism, Stoicism, and esoteric Jewish mysticism. It was a worldview that historians broadly categorize under the umbrella term Gnosticism.
And stepping into the Gnostic worldview requires completely abandoning the traditional Sunday school narrative. It reads way more like epic cosmic science fiction. The foundational premise of Gnosticism basically attempts to solve the ultimate philosophical problem. If God is perfectly good, why is the physical world filled with disease, decay, inequality, and suffering?
Right, the classic problem of evil. Traditional theology often answers that question with the concept of human free will and the fall in the Garden of Eden. You know, a perfect world broken by human disobedience.
It's our fault.
Exactly. But the Gnostics looked at the brutality of nature, the food chain, natural disasters, infantile diseases, and they concluded that the design itself was inherently flawed. They reasoned that a perfectly good, ineffable, boundless deity could not possibly have authored this material slaughterhouse.
So they completely split the concept of the divine. They said, okay, there's an ultimate true God. But this true God doesn't have a white beard and sit on a cloud.
The true God is entirely transcendent, unknowable, formless light. This deity exists in a realm of absolute spiritual perfection and energetic fullness known as the pleroma.
The pleroma, I love that word.
It literally means fullness. And within the pleroma, there are various intermediate divine emanations. You can think of them as fractal expressions of the true God, and these are called eons.
So the pleroma is pure consciousness. No heavy matter, no entropy. But then this cosmic tragedy happens, and it doesn't start with a rebellion like Lucifer falling from heaven in the traditional story. It starts with like a crisis of curiosity.
That's a perfect way to phrase it. Within the pleroma exists one of the highest eons, a divine feminine being named Sophia, which translates to wisdom. And in systems like Valentinian or Sethian Gnosticism, Sophia undergoes a profound internal crisis. She either desires to fully comprehend the incomprehensible greatness of the true God, which is an impossible task, or she attempts to emanate, to create entirely out of her own being without the active participation of her divine masculine consort.
So she tries to give birth to a new thought by herself.
Yes. And because her action is born out of passion, longing, and a lack of complete understanding, it causes a tear in the fabric of the pleroma. Her flawed emanation is expelled from the realm of fullness into the kenoma, the cosmic void, the emptiness.
And this flawed emanation, this aborted thought of wisdom, becomes a being that the texts call the demiurge, the half-maker, often named Yaldabaoth. And this is where the theology gets genuinely terrifying. The demiurge is a monstrous, ignorant being with the body of a serpent and the face of a lion.
It's a very striking image. And because the demiurge is born outside the pleroma and completely disconnected from the true God, he has no memory of his origins. He opens his eyes in the cosmic void, looks around, and assumes he is the absolute authority. He's the one who declares, "I am a jealous God, and there is no other God beside me."
Wait, it's a direct quote from the Old Testament.
It is. The Gnostics made a radical and deeply controversial theological pivot here. They identified the creator God of the Hebrew Bible, the deity who demands blood sacrifice, creates physical matter, and enforces rigid laws as this ignorant demiurge. They said he is not the true God. He's a flawed middle manager who doesn't realize he has a boss.
A middle manager with a lion face. That is wild. And to maintain his illusion of control, the demiurge takes the heavy, chaotic matter of the void, mixed with a little bit of the divine spark that fell with him, and he builds our physical universe. He builds the planetary spheres, and he creates minions to help him run the simulation.
These minions are called the archons, or rulers. They govern the planetary spheres that encircle the Earth, and their entire function is to enforce ignorance. Because humanity contains that trapped divine spark, the residual light of Sophia, we are a threat to the demiurge's absolute rule.
We have something he doesn't have.
Exactly. So the archons use the weight of the material world, bodily passions, rigid moral laws, and the fear of death to keep the divine spark asleep.
Okay, I want to pause here for a second and just talk to you, listening to this right now. Think about your commute this morning. Or think about the exhaustion of paying bills, managing a sickness, dealing with political gridlock, or just the sheer heavy fatigue of keeping a human body fed and alive. Have you ever had a moment where you looked around and thought, you know, I don't belong here. This grind cannot be the ultimate reality.
That a visceral feeling of alienation is the core Gnostic experience.
2,000 years ago, they felt that exact same exhaustion. They looked at the world and said, we feel trapped because we are trapped. Our true nature isn't this decaying biological machinery. Our true nature is a shard of light, a fragment of Sophia that belongs back in the pleroma.
And this fundamentally redefines the concept of salvation. In Orthodox Christianity, salvation is achieved through a blood sacrifice, Jesus dying on the cross to pay the penalty for human sin. But in Gnosticism, you don't need a blood sacrifice because you haven't committed a moral crime against the true God. You are a victim of cosmic kidnapping.
Cosmic kidnapping. So salvation isn't about forgiveness. It's about waking up.
It is gnosis, a Greek word that translates roughly to knowledge, but not intellectual knowledge, like memorizing a map or a math formula. Gnosis is a profound, experiential, intuitive realization of your own divine origin. When you achieve gnosis, the illusion of the material world shatters, and you remember who you are.
Okay, but if I'm playing devil's advocate here, though, this entire cosmology, archons, planetary spheres, a false creator god keeping humanity trapped in ignorance, it sounds exactly like the plot of The Matrix. I mean, they literally invented simulation theory 2 millennia before the microchip.
Oh, absolutely. The parallels to modern simulation theory are frequently noted by philosophers today. But for the second-century mystics reading these texts, this was not a metaphor or a science fiction thought experiment. It was a literal map of reality. It provided the exact mechanics for how the soul escapes the simulation after death.
Which brings us directly to the star of our deep dive, the Gospel of Mary. Because if you need a map to escape the archons, the Gospel of Mary is the ultimate survival guide. And the person teaching this advanced course isn't Peter or John, it's Mary Magdalene.
So let's open the Berlin Codex and look at the physical text of the Gospel of Mary. And the first thing a reader experiences is an acute sense of loss.
Because the first 6 pages are just gone, torn away. We basically come into the movie halfway through the second act. It's page 7. The scene is a post-resurrection dialogue. The Savior is speaking with his disciples, and someone asks this deeply philosophical, almost stoic question. They ask, will matter then be utterly destroyed or not?
And the Savior responds with a monistic cosmology of dissolution. He states, all nature, all formations, all creatures exist in and with one another, and they will be resolved again into their own roots. For the nature of matter is resolved into the roots of its own nature alone.
It's like ancient thermodynamics. He's saying the physical world is temporary, the demiurge's creation has an expiration date, eventually everything physical dissolves back into baseline energy. But then Peter asks the follow-up question that I think completely shatters the Orthodox paradigm. Peter asks, what is the sin of the world?
Which is a huge question, because in traditional theology, sin is a moral failing. It is a rebellion against the laws of God.
Right, and the Savior looks at Peter and basically says, there is no such thing as sin. I can only imagine the disciples' faces. It's a theological earthquake.
The Savior clarifies this shocking statement, though. He says there is no inherent sin in the world as an abstract, malevolent force. Instead, he explains, you yourselves are what produces sin when you act in accordance with the nature of adultery, which is called sin.
Okay, but adultery here isn't about 2 people having a physical affair, right? It's an ontological concept.
Yes, it is the adultery of the soul. It means mixing things that fundamentally do not belong together. When the eternal divine spark of the soul chooses to attach itself to the temporary, decaying passions of the physical body, that entanglement is adultery. Sin isn't breaking a rule on a cosmic checklist. Sin is ignorance. It is forgetting your spiritual root and investing your identity in a meat sack that is destined to dissolve.
It's a mistake of identity. Wow. And after dropping this massive teaching, the Savior commissions them to go preach the good news. He explicitly warns them not to lay down any new rules or laws beyond what he has said, lest they become slaves to those laws. And then he leaves.
And the reaction of the male disciples is incredibly telling here. They do not feel empowered.
No, they completely fall apart. They start weeping. They say, if they didn't spare him, how will they spare us? They are paralyzed by the fear of physical death, which basically proves they haven't actually understood the teaching about the temporary nature of matter. And this is the moment Mary Magdalene steps into her power. She stands up, greets them, turns their hearts toward the good, and says, do not weep and be distressed. Let us praise his greatness, for he has prepared us and made us true human beings.
And Peter recognizes her unique spiritual maturity in this moment. He turns to her and says, "Sister, we know that the Savior loved you more than the rest of women. Tell us the words of the Savior which you remember, which you know, but we do not."
He literally gives her the floor. He invites her to preach the secret advanced syllabus. Mary agrees, saying, "What is hidden from you, I will proclaim to you." She then begins to describe a private vision she had of the Savior.
The text immediately dives into the mechanics of visionary experience. Mary asks the Savior in her vision, "Lord, does a person who sees a vision see it through the soul or through the spirit?"
And the Savior says it's neither. He says the vision is perceived by the mind, the nous in Greek, which sits directly between the soul and the spirit.
This is a crucial psychological distinction in ancient thought. The psyche, or soul, is often associated with the animating life force and emotions. The pneuma, or spirit, is the divine spark itself. But the nous, the mind, is the centering consciousness, the eye of the heart. It is the faculty capable of bridging the gap between the human and the divine. By locating the vision in the nous, the text argues that divine revelation isn't a random supernatural hallucination. It requires a cultivated, centered, spiritually mature consciousness.
That makes so much sense. And using that centered mind, Mary recounts the journey of the soul ascending through the planetary spheres. It's the map to beat the archons. The soul has to bypass what the text calls the 7 powers of wrath.
These are the cosmic gatekeepers. They represent the psychological and material fetters that keep humanity enslaved to the demiurge's simulation.
Let's unpack these 7 powers because they are psychologically profound. We have darkness, desire, ignorance, zeal for death, the realm of the flesh, the foolish wisdom of the flesh, and the wisdom of the wrathful person.
Darkness is the foundational state of being asleep to your divine nature. Desire is the relentless craving for material satisfaction that can never actually be fulfilled. Ignorance is the active refusal to see the truth.
But what about zeal for death? That sounds so specific. How does a human being manifest a zeal for death?
Think of it as the human obsession with destruction, warfare, and the accumulation of power that ultimately leads to ruin. It is the societal impulse toward entropy. When we build economic or political systems that prioritize extraction and violence over human flourishing, we are actively participating in the zeal for death.
It's the self-sabotage built into the system. And foolish wisdom of the flesh, I see that everywhere today. It's materialism masquerading as pragmatism. It's that cynical voice that says, you are only your bank account, your social status, your physical attractiveness. Anything spiritual is just a fairy tale.
Exactly. When the soul encounters these powers during its ascent, the powers interrogate it. They try to pull it back down, asking things like, "Where are you going, human killer?" Or, "What binds you?" They try to induce guilt and fear.
But Mary's soul knows the cheat codes. The soul answers the powers with total detachment. It says, "What binds me has been slain, and what surrounds me has been destroyed, and my desire has been brought to an end, and ignorance has died." The soul essentially looks at the archons and says, "You have no leverage over me anymore. I do not value the things you control."
And having defeated the 7th power, the soul achieves silence. It escapes the planetary spheres and enters into eternal rest in the pleroma. It is a stunning, triumphant vision of inner liberation.
It is breathtaking, really. So Mary finishes delivering this incredible liberating map to the cosmos, and the guys in the room absolutely hate it.
They really do. The final pages of the Gospel of Mary feature a jarring tonal shift.
Right.
We move from this transcendent mystical poetry to a bitter, localized ecclesiastical fight.
Yeah, Andrew speaks up first, and he is the embodiment of the status quo. He says, "I don't know what you guys think, but I at least do not believe that the Savior said this. For certainly these teachings are strange ideas." So he basically attacks her theology just because it doesn't match his preconceived notions.
And then Peter follows Andrew, and his attack is deeply personal and entirely rooted in gender. The very man who asked her to speak moments ago now turns on her. He asks the other men, "Did he really speak privately with a woman and not openly to us? Are we to turn about and all listen to her? Did he prefer her to us?"
It's just raw, pathetic jealousy. You can feel the structural panic setting in for them. Mary starts crying. She says, "My brother Peter, what do you think? Do you think that I thought this up myself in my heart, or that I am lying about the Savior?"
At this point, Levi, whom we also know as Matthew, steps in to shut Peter down. Levi says, "Peter, you have always been hot-tempered. Now I see you contending against the woman like the adversaries. But if the Savior made her worthy, who are you indeed to reject her? Surely the Savior knows her very well. That is why he loved her more than us."
If the Savior made her worthy, who are you indeed to reject her? That question echoes through 2,000 years of history. Why does this specific fight end the book? What is the author trying to tell us here?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this isn't just a historical transcript of a squabble among the disciples. The author in the 2nd century is using this narrative to make a profound argument about the nature of religious authority itself. The early church was fracturing into 2 distinct models.
Okay, model number 1 is represented by Peter and Andrew.
Yes, this is the model of institutional hierarchical succession. It argues that authority is based on physical transmission. The idea is Jesus taught the 12 male apostles publicly, and they passed those rules down to the bishops. It relies on a standardized public rulebook. It is inherently patriarchal and deeply suspicious of ongoing personal revelation.
And the model number 2 is represented by Mary and Levi.
This is the charismatic experiential model. It argues that true authority does not come from holding a physical office or memorizing a public doctrine. It comes from spiritual maturity. It comes from direct, ongoing gnosis. Mary's authority is legitimate precisely because she's done the inner work to develop her nous. She can actually perceive the divine reality, regardless of her gender.
The text is effectively screaming to the reader, do not follow the men who wear the robes and claim the titles, but are still paralyzed by the fear of death. Follow the woman who has actually achieved inner peace and understands the temporary nature of the universe.
It is a devastating, sophisticated critique of illegitimate ecclesiastical power.
And when you start questioning male-dominated ecclesiastical power, it naturally opens the door to questioning the gender of the divine itself, which is another massive component of Gnostic theology. The traditional Judeo-Christian framework is fiercely patriarchal. God is the Father, the King, the Lord. He creates the universe. But the Gnostics looked at that and said, you are missing half the equation.
The Gnostic conception of the Godhead is profoundly dual-gendered. In Valentinian systems, the supreme, ineffable deity, the primal Father, the depth is eternally paired with a divine feminine principle.
And they gave her names that evoke spaciousness and generation. Silence, grace, the divine womb, Barbello, the mother of all.
They reason that if the true God is perfect fullness, that fullness must encompass both the masculine principle of structure and the feminine principle of generation and reception. A purely masculine God would be incomplete. Many Gnostic prayers were addressed equally to the Divine Father and the Divine Mother.
This cosmic elevation of the feminine directly trickles down to how they viewed the earthly women surrounding Jesus. There is this incredibly intricate theological mapping known as the 3 Miriams or the 3 Marys.
The Gnostics were master symbolists. They took the epic, tragic story of the Aeon Sophia, the divine wisdom who fell from the pleroma, suffered in the void, and was eventually redeemed, and they mapped those 3 stages directly onto the historical women in the Gospels.
Okay, so let's walk through that. Stage 1, pre-fall Sophia, the pure celestial wisdom before the tragedy.
That maps to Mary, the mother of Jesus. She embodies the undefiled vessel of light, representing continuous, uncorrupted wisdom.
Then stage 2, Sophia Achamoth. This is the fallen, fragmented wisdom. She is trapped in the material cosmos, suffering, longing for her home in the light.
She is mapped to Mary, the sister of Jesus, often identified with Mary of Bethany. She represents the intense emotional struggle of the divine spark trying to find its way in the darkness of the demiurge's world.
And finally, stage 3, the redeemed Sophia. The wisdom who has remembered her true nature, awakened to her power, and is spiritually reunited with the divine logos in what they called the bridal chamber.
This maps directly to Mary Magdalene. She is the terrestrial incarnation of the fully awakened soul. She isn't just a disciple taking notes. She is the embodiment of active, triumphant gnosis.
And this framework isn't just a dusty academic footnote either. It is actively practiced today. Modern esoteric groups like the Ecclesia Pistis Sophia or the Sophian Fellowship have built an entire living theology around this called the 7 Faces of the Gnostic Goddess, where Mary Magdalene is revered as the Christ Sophia.
The way these modern esoteric traditions approach the Virgin Mary is equally fascinating, primarily because it relies heavily on the ancient concept of Docetism.
Right, let's unpack Docetism really quick.
Yeah.
Because if the Gnostics believed that physical matter was a trap created by an evil demiurge, they obviously couldn't believe that a divine being like Christ would actually put on a physical meat suit, right?
Exactly. The term comes from the Greek dukin, meaning to seem or to appear. Docetism is the belief that divine beings did not have truly physical, fleshy bodies. They only appeared to be physical to human eyes. They were essentially bodies made of pure spiritual light or advanced energetic projections.
So if Jesus was a being of pure light, what does that make his mother?
In these esoteric interpretations, the Virgin Mary and Joseph are not viewed as regular historical humans who just followed the rules. They're viewed as ascended masters, beings who had achieved such a high state of God consciousness that their physical realities were completely subordinated to their spiritual nature. Their marriage is understood to have been purely spiritual, existing on a soul level without the necessity of physical intercourse.
And her death. Traditional Catholicism has the Assumption of Mary, where she is taken body and soul into heaven. How does the esoteric Docetic view handle her exit from the physical world?
They equate it with the Tibetan Buddhist concept of the rainbow body.
Which is when an enlightened master achieves such a high vibratory state at the time of death that their physical biology literally dissolves into pure spirit matter, leaving nothing behind but maybe hair and nails. It's a total spiritualization of the physical form.
It is a remarkable example of syncretism, drawing parallels between Eastern mysticism and early Christian esoterica.
Speaking of advanced esoteric teachings, we have to mention a monumental text called the Pistis Sophia.
Written around the 3rd or 4th century, Pistis Sophia presents a timeline where Jesus doesn't just ascend to heaven immediately after the resurrection. He actually stays on earth for 11 years, teaching his disciples the lower mysteries. But then, a cosmic shift occurs. He receives his true garment of light, and he begins to teach the highly complex, higher cosmological mysteries.
And the star pupil of this 11-year masterclass is, without question, Mary Magdalene. While the male disciples are constantly interrupting with basic questions or expressing confusion, Mary Magdalene is interpreting the deepest cosmological symbols. She embodies intuitive intelligence cutting through the noise.
Between Mary Magdalene, Martha, and Salome, the text presents a coherent, radically feminine model of spiritual authority that contrasts sharply with the emerging Orthodox patriarchy.
But history is rarely clean. And as historians looking back at this era, we have to examine the entire spectrum of how these texts were used. We've talked about Mary as the pure contemplative mystic, but there's another side to the Gnostic coin found in a lost text known as the Greater Questions of Mary.
This requires us to look at the extreme edges of the anti-material worldview. If you believe the physical world and its laws are created by an evil demiurge, you generally go one of two ways. You either become an extreme ascetic, starving the body, avoiding sex, trying to detach from matter entirely, which is the path of the Gospel of Mary.
Or you go the opposite direction. You become a libertine. You say, the physical laws are a lie invented by a false god. Therefore, I can break all of them to prove my spiritual superiority.
The Greater Questions of Mary purportedly falls into the latter category. I say purportedly because we do not possess the actual text. We only know about it from fragments quoted in a massive catalog of heresies written by a 4th century Orthodox bishop named Epiphanius of Salamis.
Epiphanius was basically writing the ultimate hit piece, and he claims that certain libertine groups, like the Fabianites, use the Greater Questions of Mary to justify incredibly transgressive sacramental practices.
According to Epiphanius, the text describes a post-resurrection scene where Jesus performs a deeply shocking, explicitly sexual physiological act, and then consumes the resulting bodily fluids as a bizarre form of Eucharist, telling Mary, "Thus we must do that we may live."
And the fragment says Mary was so terrified by witnessing this that she fell to the ground in a state of total cognitive dissonance until Jesus raised her up and rebuked her for her lack of faith. Before we go any further, I want to make it absolutely crystal clear to you listening that we are not taking sides here or endorsing any of these theological stances, whether orthodox, feminist, or libertine. We are impartially reporting on these controversial religious texts to explore the historical source material.
That is a crucial point. We are observing the historical record. And Epiphanius claimed these groups used this narrative to ritualize the breaking of conventional sexual morality, viewing earthly taboos as archontic chains to be shattered.
But here's the massive historical caveat. Was this real, or is this the ancient equivalent of political fake news? Smearing your opponents by accusing them of wild sexual deviancy was the oldest rhetorical trick in the Roman playbook. The Romans accused the early Orthodox Christians of cannibalism and incest. It stands to reason the Orthodox Christians would use the same smears against the Gnostics.
Historians remain deeply divided on this. Some believe Epiphanius was preserving genuine, albeit radical, ritual practices. Others believe he was simply inventing horrific scenarios to ensure these texts were destroyed by the authorities.
Either way, it shows how vicious the battle over the definition of truth became. Which brings us to the implications for today. All of this cosmology, this ecclesiastical warfare, these lost texts, What does this actually mean for modern religion? How are these ancient fragments actively reshaping faith right now?
A prime example of this active reshaping is the Roman Catholic woman priests movement.
Right, let's talk about Reverend Dr. Bridget Mary Meehan, who serves as a bishop in this movement.
Dr. Meehan and the woman priests do not view the Gospel of Mary as a quirky historical artifact. They use it as a foundational historical mirror to prove that female sacramental leadership is not a modern liberal invention, but rather a faithful continuation of the earliest Jesus movement.
They point to Mary Magdalene preaching to Peter and say, look, women were leading from day one. The patriarchy was the corruption, not the original design.
Furthermore, Dr. Meehan makes a very astute theological argument regarding the concept of gnosis. She argues that the core Gnostic pursuit, direct, inner experiential knowledge of the divine, has always existed within the accepted boundaries of the Catholic Church. It just got rebranded.
If a 2nd century Egyptian woman has a vision of Jesus in her nous, she gets labeled a Gnostic heretic. But if a 16th century Spanish nun has the exact same kind of internal vision, she gets canonized.
Exactly. Dr. Meehan points to accepted Orthodox mystics like Saint Teresa of Avila or Meister Eckhart, who taught contemplation or infused wisdom. The mechanics of their mysticism are practically identical to the Gospel of Mary. It highlights how institutional authority dictates the labels. The exact same spiritual experience is heresy when it threatens the power structure, and sanctity when the power structure can control it.
That friction over how to label things has actually triggered a massive debate among secular academics today, too. Scholars are actively fighting over whether we should even use the word Gnosticism anymore.
It is one of the most heated debates in religious studies right now. On one side, you have feminist scholars like Karen L. King at Harvard. She views the Gospel of Mary as a brilliant, radical subversion of 2nd century gender and ecclesiastical hierarchy. She embraces the category to show how diverse early Christianity was.
But then you have scholars like Michael A. Williams, who wrote a book essentially called Stop Using the Word Gnosticism.
Williams argues that Gnosticism is an artificial construct invented by heresy hunters like Irenaeus. It was a convenient bucket to dump all their enemies into. Williams points out the sheer absurdity of the category. If you take the highly refined philosophical asceticism of the Gospel of Mary and put it next to the radical, fluid-consuming rituals alleged in the Questions of Mary, they have zero practical or theological overlap. Lumping them both together as Gnosticism creates a false monolith that obscures the localized reality of these texts.
It's like putting a vegan monk and a hedonistic rock star in the exact same category just because they both happen to dislike the government. It doesn't tell you anything useful about what they actually believe.
Precisely. And there is an even darker consequence to this theology that historians consistently warn about, regarding its relationship with Judaism.
We definitely have to address the demiurge problem.
When Gnostic theology rejects the creator of the material world as an ignorant, jealous, flawed being in their specific historical context, the creator God they're rejecting is Yahweh, the God of the Hebrew Bible.
They essentially turned the God of Genesis into a cosmic villain.
Yes, they severed the theological roots connecting the Jesus movement to its Jewish foundations. And historically, this theological move has had devastating real-world consequences. By portraying the Jewish law as a tool of archonic entrapment and the God of Judaism as an ignorant tyrant, these ideas can and have provided theological cover for supersessionism and horrific anti-Semitism throughout history. It's a stark reminder that abstract theological frameworks carry massive cultural weight.
Ideas have bodies. They affect real people. So for nearly 2,000 years, human beings, bishops, emperors, theologians have been curating the story. They decided which books got copied and which books got burned. They managed the narrative. But here is where we pivot to the present. Because today, the entities doing the heavy lifting to translate and understand these texts aren't just humans in dusty libraries.
We have entered the era of digital philology. Modern artificial intelligence is acting as the new archaeologist of the ancient world.
And here's where it gets really interesting. When someone mentions AI and ancient texts, it's so easy to imagine a Dan Brown novel where a supercomputer spits out a hidden Da Vinci Code message about the Holy Grail. But the reality of what researchers at places like the Coptica department at Humboldt University in Berlin are doing is far more mathematical and, frankly, way more fascinating.
It is entirely about complex comparative linguistics. AI is performing the kind of heavy mathematical lifting that a human lifespan simply cannot accommodate. One of the primary methodologies being employed is called stylometry.
Stylometry is basically linguistic fingerprinting, right?
Yes, essentially. Every author has a subconscious statistical rhythm to their writing, the frequency of certain function words, the length of sentences, the specific syntactical habits. AI analyzes these patterns using tools like engram profiles.
Okay, let me try an analogy for an engram. Think about looking at a chef's recipe history. If a chef always pairs garlic with onions, that's a bigram, a two-item chunk. If the AI analyzes 1,000 recipes and maps that pattern, it knows the chef's style. If it suddenly scans a new recipe that claims to be from that chef, but it pairs garlic with strawberries, the AI flags it immediately. It says that statistically, the original chef didn't write this.
That is an excellent analogy. The AI breaks the Coptic text into these engram chunks, unigrams, bigrams, trigrams. By calculating the frequency and proximity of these chunks across thousands of pages of ancient literature, the AI constructs what we call a semantic vector space.
A semantic vector space. That sounds incredibly dense.
It essentially turns words into numbers and plots them as coordinates in a multidimensional space. Words that are used in similar contexts are plotted closer together. This allows the AI to map intertextuality, how different texts borrow from or influence each other with terrifying precision.
So if a newly discovered Gnostic text claims to be written by the Apostle John, the AI can plot its semantic vector space against the canonical Gospel of John. And it might say, look, this new text clusters heavily around apocalyptic motifs, whereas the canonical John clusters around logos motifs. There is a 98% linguistic variance. This is pseudepigraphical, written by someone else using John's name.
Precisely. It reveals the editorial layers and the hidden theological networks between different communities that human scholars might miss. But the application of AI goes far beyond just proving authorship. They are using generative AI models to actually reconstruct the physical lacunae, the missing holes in the papyrus.
This is the part that blows my mind. The Gospel of Mary is missing pages 1 through 6 and 11 through 14. We are using AI to hallucinate the missing thoughts of a 2nd century mystic. How does it actually do that without just making stuff up?
The process relies on what we call papyrological heuristics. The AI model is trained on a massive corpus of Coptic and Greek literature, but it is then heavily constrained by the physical reality of the specific manuscript.
Meaning the math is restricted by the geometry of the torn paper.
Exactly. The AI calculates the specific scribe's average character width and line length. It measures the exact millimeter width of the tear of the papyrus. It analyzes the microscopic traces of ink left on the frayed edges of the hole. It factors in the specific grammatical rules of the Sahidic Coptic dialect being used. The AI then generates thousands of statistically probable word combinations that not only fit the theological context of the surrounding sentence, but physically fit into the exact pixel width of the missing hole.
It is mathematically bridging a 2,000-year gap in human thought. But this creates a massive philosophical parallel, Frane. Think about the system admins of the 2nd century. Irenaeus and the bishops engaged in massive canonical curation. They decided which texts were truth and which were heresy. They actively diminished Mary Magdalene's authority, eventually conflating her with a repentant prostitute in later centuries to weaken her standing. They managed the reality of millions of people through textual control.
It was a highly successful, centuries-long campaign of narrative infrastructure.
Now compare that to today. We rely almost entirely on algorithmic curation. AI search engines, social media algorithms, and large language models decide what information is surfaced as truth and what is suppressed as misinformation or noise. We are building systems that actively curate our digital reality.
This raises an important question, perhaps the defining question of our technological era. When we are presented with a text, whether it is a canonical gospel authorized by a Roman emperor, a Gnostic revelation dug up from the sand, or an informational summary generated by a neural network, where does the locus of truth actually reside?
Right, because structurally, they are all just using tools to construct meaning. The early church used councils and creeds. The Gnostics used elaborate mythic symbols of archons and aeons. And modern LLMs use semantic vector spaces and probability distributions.
If the tools of meaning-making are always mediated by a bishop's agenda or a programmer's training data, how do we distinguish between a legitimate reflection of reality, an algorithmically generated hallucination, or a paranoid delusion? The author of the Gospel of Mary would argue that truth cannot be found in the external structure. It can only be verified internally by the nous, the centered mind of the receiver.
It's the ultimate Gnostic problem, updated for a silicon world. We are still trapped in a matrix of information, trying to figure out what is base reality and what is a simulation designed to keep us asleep. Well, let's pull all these threads together. What an unbelievable journey this has been. We started in the dusty antiquities markets of Cairo and the fertilizer-rich dirt of Nag Hammadi, unearthing fragile codices that completely defied the orthodox timeline. We traveled up through the cosmic barriers of the archons, dodging the seven powers of wrath, to explore a breathtaking theology where the creator of the world is a flawed mistake, and salvation is an inside job of waking up.
We witnessed the bitter, deeply human theological battlegrounds of the early church. We saw how Mary Magdalene's charismatic visionary authority was systematically challenged by an emerging male institutional hierarchy. We explored the vast concept of the divine feminine, the psychological matrix of the three Miriams, and how modern movements like the Roman Catholic woman priests are wielding these ancient texts to reclaim their spiritual heritage today.
And finally, we arrived in the sterile, climate-controlled servers of modern AI, where stylometry, engrams, and machine learning are acting as the new archaeologists. They are deciphering Coptic script, reconstructing torn papyrus, and forcing us to question the very mechanics of how truth and reality are constructed.
It brings us full circle to the underlying tension of every text we examine today. And I'd like to leave you with a final thought to mull over, one that bridges the ancient Gnostic worldview and our rapidly accelerating technological present.
Lay it on us.
If the ancient Gnostics were right, if they fundamentally understood that the material world is a flawed illusion, a simulation governed by lesser ignorant intelligences demanding our constant attention and energy, and today we are actively training artificial intelligences that hallucinate their own realities, algorithmically curate our digital lives, and increasingly control the financial and social infrastructure of our world, are we, in a very real sense, building our own archons? Are we writing the code for the cosmic rulers that the Gnostics warned us about? And if we are, where do we look to find our own inner spark of gnosis to wake up before we are entirely trapped in a simulation of our own making?
That is a thought that is going to keep me up at night. The system admins are no longer bishops and rogues. They are algorithms and server farms. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly deep dive. As you go back into the physical world today, as you navigate your commute and your screens, remember the words of the Savior from the Gospel of Mary. Don't let anyone lead you astray by saying, look here or look there. Seek the child of true humanity within yourself. Until next time, keep digging, keep questioning, and keep waking up.